Joel, this is the Global Digest think tank group, and you are our special guest today. You still working at the UN, or you are already retired, or what is your position, your status right now? Please, Joel.
So I'm retired from the UN. I continue working, but more with things of my own choice in Uganda and so on. So, but indeed, I stopped working for the UN like 2 years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago. Not only, by the way, the High Commissioner for Refugees, but I worked also, of course, with other UN agencies. So, but my last position was indeed as the country representative of the High Commissioner for Refugees in Uganda, where I still work with some people there on education, on garbage management, and so on.
Some are critical issue like some refugee or human rights violation cases, even that they are, excluded. So in my view, if we are not able to function those very basic things, UN is a kind of collapsing in terms of humanitarian issue, refugee issue. So how do you see UN system and the future of UN and those activity, the program of UN?
When you look at, for example, to take another separate example, the example of USAID, which was totally dismantled by the new regime in the United States of America, you wonder, okay, so it is creating a lot of suffering. At the same time, it is also creating a rethinking of, how much dependent were some countries on USAID and what is the real impact of its demise. So the impact is certainly there, but maybe not very even across the sectors, nor very even across the country. So all that to say that sometimes we feel that we are indispensable, but at the same time, it creates a rethinking of what is our true impact on the ground. And my point is with the UN that I think there is a need for a rethinking. Basically, I think the UN still is fundamental for the stability of the world, but not necessarily in areas that we think are crucial. For example, a lot of activities in the field that the United Nations is doing don't need to be carried out by the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations very often act as glorified non-governmental organizations, glorified NGOs, when they should not. I think the UN should very often confine itself much more strictly to activities where it has, I would say, a natural comparative advantage, be it on for example, governance. The UN presence on the ground is fairly unique. Not many other entities have such a presence on the ground. So this presence should be put to better use, should be reduced, in my opinion, but put to better use first to support the countries at central level, but also at local level in particular. And it also should be much more focused on governance. Having the United Nations build a school or a health center is fine. But if there is no system to back it up at the end of the day, it serves the purpose becomes very limited. Or if it builds a road and doesn't ensure that there is maintenance behind, it doesn't serve any purpose really. But since governance, you see, is very complicated because it's a long-term effort. Very often, not only the UN, but the so-called international community very often does not want to deal with it and just wants to create more infrastructure, to deal with small projects and forget the real big issue, which is the governance. So if the UN were to focus much more on that and on coordinating efforts during emergencies or during a crisis of all kinds, maybe first it would not need so much money. It would be much more focused, and it would have more credibility. But still, it is required. Its presence is essential, but not to the level that it is now, nor doing things that sometimes it does not need to do, or that other people should do better. For example, take the African Union. The African Union is not very strong, we know, but it has the will to do better and more. The UN, for example, should support the African Union. It does it a bit, but what it does also is that it has its own Economic Commission for Africa. Why? Why do you need an Economic Commission for Africa when you have an African Union which has its own Commission for Economic Affairs? Why do that? Same thing for Latin America, for Asia, even for Europe. There is still an Economic Commission for Europe within the UN. It's a small outfit based in Geneva, but why have these things?
It's overlapping.
Overlapping of responsibilities, redundancies, and also overlapping between even agencies in the field. So which create a lot of competition. And this competition is even fueled, I would say, by the donors. For example, when a donor, whichever country, could make a call for tenders to finance a program, it opens it to the UN and NGOs. So the UN fight between themselves and they fight NGOs, which is crazy. It's a crazy system that is fueled also by the international community. So you need to have the courage in the UN. You need to have strong leaders in the UN who are not afraid to be a bit not very popular, to say, okay, my agency needs to merge with another agency and needs to reduce,
governing system. The key issue is isn't the responsible Secretary General, or which part or which person is more appropriate to deal in this governing system?
So sorry, when I was referring to governance or governing system, I meant that, but I will come back to your question. I meant that in what we call in the field, when the UN is in Uganda or in Laos or in whichever country where it is present, in these countries, the UN should focus much more on helping the authorities, wherever they are, better govern their own system. Not doing, but helping the government do. You see what I mean? That's what I was referring to earlier on. Now, coming back to your question now, I think indeed that if the UN wants to survive, the Secretary General, the present one, and the next one, and all the heads of the agencies, and there are many of them, there are dozens of entities within the UN system, should have the courage to look at their own backyard, say, what are the activities where I have the most impact? And discard the rest. And also, am I doing my job correctly? Instead of saying, okay, now we have a financial crisis, let's cut 20% of the staff. But cutting 20% of the staff without really taking a hard look at where the UN agencies have their own advantage and where are the best place to carry out their mandate, that is really very short-sighted, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to create some savings, but you are just also embarking into sort of a slow death movement, because this will not satisfy the international community or certain donors, and it will, in fact, in a way, give more ammunition to those who are against the UN and want to see the UN die. Because if you don't have a vision for what the UN should be about, very clear vision in terms of coordination, calling, the convening power, the power of convening big meetings, sometimes with mixed result or mixed usefulness, but also coordinating actors on the ground. Again, as I said, trying to support government do their jobs better. If we don't do this job of focusing on these things, we will continue doing things that other people can do. And we will continue losing credibility and having less and less money. So it will be a slow death. So we need to have the courage, or the heads of agencies under the leadership of the Secretary General need to have the courage to take a hard look at what should happen, including merging, including closing entities and merging them for better, to be more efficient.
The importance of headquarter office, UN headquarter office, and most of staff and most people, they want to stay in the New York and Geneva only, and a lot of UN staff are there, and those cities are very expensive, and probably the funding of UN are spending a lot in New York and Geneva.
I think in terms of recruitment procedures, these procedures are so lengthy and so heavy.
Right.
I would say, on the contrary, in a way, the UN has improved a lot in terms of gender balance, for example, at senior level, at medium level, at all levels. So you have a better gender balance than ever before. So there, I think it's a fairly clear success. In terms of geographical representation, there is still indeed a sort of more heavy presence of the rich countries of the West, as we used to call it, or the North, depending on how you want to call it. But this is strongly diminishing, gradually diminishing anyway, and it has diminished. The problem is not really necessarily there. Plus, don't forget, I'll take my own example. I was in Uganda. I had a lot of people, over almost at one point 1,000 staff in Uganda for the High Commissioner for Refugees. But 90+% were Ugandans anyway. So the local staff is always over much more, in a much greater number than the number of so-called international staff. So it has always been it is always like that. And whenever I had to cut staff, at first I always try to reduce number of international staff, and I try to protect, to the extent possible, local national staff. That I did, but now where they stand now with this crisis, are cutting everything, regardless in a way. I'm not saying that they don't have a strategy. I am saying that their strategy is weak and not very courageous. But so in terms of merit, that's another issue. You see, for any position, let's say in New York and Geneva, because as you rightly said, many people want to stay in Geneva or New York. For me, they're bureaucrats. UN, but they're bureaucrats. They're not field people like I think I've been, although I did work in Geneva too. But so for any single post in Geneva or New York, you have hundreds of people applying. Hundreds. So it takes an average of 1 to 2 years to fill this position. It's a crazy process. So whether at the end of the day you reach a merit-based system is always problematic. Who has access to these applications, this very long process and so on. And there are very, I would say, standard questions, whether you're on a low-ranking position or high-ranking position, they more or less always ask you the same questions. And they always send a state of very, very boring, and that is totally, you have to be, some people are better at that than others. So in a way, it helps those who know, typically who have been educated into the system. So the recruitment process is bad because it's too heavy. Does it go against merit? No, but it's too heavy, and as you said, too many UN civil servants are based in headquarters. I agree, but at the same time, we're too many in the field too, as I just said before. There's a need to reduce. There's a need to reduce number of staff. I agree, because many things we do, we should not do, as I already said.
As you said, recruitment system is so heavy and it's not hitting the right one, Even they have a lot of application and long time process, but they couldn't neither able to select the best one, they are selecting the same thing, even that much complex recruitment system. One bad thing is in political appointment, not necessarily merit appointment. Maybe UN can reduce government representative as much as possible and increase more merit and more practical, useful, and more expert in the field.
You're right in good part. The problem is how to reach the right balance between having criteria like gender balance, like geographical representation, because there is no reason why, because I'm American or French or British, I have a better chance than somebody from Myanmar or from Indonesia. Because I come from a better university. It means, by the way, it means nothing, because on the ground you are faced with other issues that have much more to do with your own common sense and also your own risk-taking and courage to take action and so on. So there has to be a balance between geographical representation, gender, and indeed, as you say, merit. But and you're right, in a way, a lot of senior positions, especially the top positions, not all the time, but 95% of the time, these are countries doing horse trading, as I call it. You take that agency, I take this agency, and so on. That's what happens. And no wonder then that at the end of the day, what you have as heads of agencies are people who are, I would say, who don't make waves necessarily. These are people who who are acceptable for everybody. So that the government say, okay, take this person because, he's not famous for being, whatever, activist or whatever. And that's a problem. Then you end up with having people who are always, I find it a pity, other people might find that it is a strength. You find people who are sort of much more moderate. So are not going to take strong action necessarily, like now during this crisis. So no wonder that we don't get what is required now in terms of strong action to change the status quo. We have people who are pro status quo basically because of the system of appointments of the very senior people. Further down, then it becomes much more government indeed calling the head of UNHCR or the head of whatever, United Nations Development Program, are saying, take this person at director level. So there is that, but in a way, it's not a minority, but almost. The problem is much more that the UN behaves like a bureaucracy, like a normal bureaucracy, with, I would say, almost appointment at the end of mediocrity, if you see what I mean. So people go up to the rank, through the ranks sometimes. I did go through the ranks, from junior to very senior in a way. But people do that, and they very often reach their, I would say, their level of competence or incompetence, but they continue going up because they don't make waves. And that's a problem in the UN. In the UN, you have many people. So you do a career in the UN. So either you stay in Geneva because you want to stay in Geneva or New York, you don't want to move, which is not good, by the way. Or indeed you go through the ranks until you become just a normal, little small bureaucrat, I would say, which is what the UN should not be about. And that's my point. Bureaucracies very often are like that in all the countries of the world, with a certain percentage of competent and incompetent people. The same for the UN, except that in the UN it's even in a way heavier and worse, because the UN should not have too many incompetent people because of the nature of our job. When you're supposed to be responsible for, like in Uganda, 1.5 million refugees, not to talk about all the other things around, you cannot really afford, and you are on an emergency mode, or and you have to save lives, you cannot afford having dead wood. And that's the problem I find. The dead wood in the UN is much more problematic, if I can put it that way, than a dead wood elsewhere. You see what I mean?
Right. I don't see it is less requirement stuff, but I see it is require a lot of stuff, but it not able to mobilize or use stuff in the exact required area, and a lot of work is there. There are 100,000 of human rights cases, but the council not able to review. If they cannot review and process the case, it's better who are not came from famous university and poor country. If he can review hundreds of cases and process the case, that is better than who famous and not able to do the work.
Yeah.
Because I know, because the victim feeling, those people in the crisis, they want justice and they want to concern their cases. But when they submitted the case at the UN, they say they cannot review all the cases and they were thrown.
Certainly, you're right in saying that human rights is certainly a very fundamental issue for the United Nations, or it should be. But not strangely, yes, ironically enough, human rights offices in the field, i.e. outside headquarters, are very small, and they're really, if you're dependent on the goodwill of the host country. So if a human rights office wants to open an office, say, in Uganda, it has to ask, of course, authorization, which is in a way right, to the Ugandan government, who may or may not agree to the presence of a human rights office. So very often, for years, there are negotiations, very low level, very discreet negotiations. At the end of the day, a human rights office opens up, but it opens in a way, very timidly, very low key, with very few people, because they don't want to rock the boat, because if they rock the boat, they may be thrown out. So here, that's again a question of standing by the UN. If the UN, if you want, has so many agencies in a given country, again, whichever, the UN is present in almost every single country of the world. It is, in fact. There is not one UN. So if a government decides to throw the High Commissioner for Human Rights office in a given country, the UN is not going to say much. They will try to negotiate, but not very strongly. So the UN lacks, if you want, the power to insist on fundamental aspect of the UN's job because of the multiplicity of its action. Again, if it was more focused, it could have more credibility and more credibility, and then maybe more power to convince, of the necessity for the UN to carry out essential activities. And human rights is certainly one of them. But human rights office in the field, in all these countries that need it, are very small in number. So no wonder they very often do not have the time to review all the cases they should review. Maybe not always the political will to do it either, because they're afraid to be thrown out. And I agree with you, is the irony of it all. That's where we should be the most courageous. And that's where we should be the most present sometimes, and we're not.
It should not represent UN who are doing such kind of, simply throwing without properly managing. It means they are neglecting their responsibility or UN mandate, isn't it?
But you're right in saying that, when there is a will, there is a way. You can always find ways to work with NGOs, with other countries. There are many examples of that in the history of, humanitarian history, or even of refugee history, like the Hmong refugees, who a lot of them migrated in great number, to the US. Why? Because there was a big, very efficient Hmong lobby group with Congress in the US. And Ukraine, whichever, so when there is a will, there is a way, always. So, as you rightly say, the UN should find a way to work with other entities when it itself cannot work as efficiently as it should. NGOs, whichever. there has to be some legality around it, but this can be found always. And at the end of the day, it's about saving people also.
Right.
It's about saving people. So we can find ways to do that. Working with NGOs, working with entities that can do the job where the UN cannot do it or does not want to do it. Well, for example, I mean, in many countries I've been to, when there's a civil war, for example, some areas in a country are blocked. So sometimes the UN doesn't want to go there because if it goes there, it would be seen as against the government. So they are very reticent. So I myself had to intervene on several occasions to go in the country, say, you're supposed to be impartial. You have to save lives also in areas controlled by non-government armed groups. So you have to go there too. So things like that. Again, if there is a will, you can always make it work. But you need to have the courage of your position and make sure that your position is, again, impartial, so that you can do the job you're supposed to do. But very often, indeed, we're faced with bureaucrats.
So the bureaucrats are not willing, or UN staff are not willing to do. That will be very difficult to persuade any activity,
You have to make noise. Make noise. That's what would be my point. Make noise. Write to the UN agencies concerned, to the top level. If it doesn't work, go higher. Go to the press. Make noise. You have to make noise. If you can go to the press or international press or whatever, you have to make noise so that it's not good. It's not a question of spreading bad rumors. It's about accountability. If an agency or staff don't do their job, it should be known, and action should be taken. There is no reason why people should not do their job. So you have to make noise.
But some even they don't care noisy.
You see, so when you make waves, they have to do something. Bureaucracies do not like waves. So if you make waves, because starting to feel a bit uncomfortable and so on. So it creates something. So you have to make waves. That would be I see what you mean. You can go to member states also. If ever you see that the UN agency doesn't want to move or whatever in a given area, you can. There's a power of writing, using social media.
As you said about recruitment, based on geography. Example, in case of Myanmar, we have a lot of crisis nowadays in Asia. At the moment, humanitarian crisis, the most crisis. But in case of France, you don't have humanitarian crisis. We can say like that. So
the UN is also a bureaucracy. So when let's take Ukraine, there is a new operation, huge operation, although not for the UN necessarily, but still a big. Let me take another crisis: Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, big operation, humanitarian, where typically the UN goes as a leader to coordinate the actions of many dozens, hundreds of NGOs. Okay, so these are new positions. So because it's a new emergency. So what does the UN do? Typically, it would send staff it already has, because you already have a quarter of staff. So you send staff you have. Or if nobody wants to go, or if there's not enough staff, you create a new job. So you have a vacancy where people are free to apply. And that's when you have all these, as I said before, all these principles of gender balance, geographical balance, blah, blah, because the UN believes, and it's not necessarily bad, that you should have at least a minimum number of international staff because it is considered very often, often correctly, that maybe national staff may be under pressure from their own local authorities or their own environment, generally speaking. So you may need a certain number of international staff to supervise or to lead the overall staff, most of whom being national staff. Then what you do for this crisis in Congo or anywhere, you recruit local staff, which are the big majority. So these are new positions also, because it's a new emergency. So then, the international staff comes in and through its own regulation, recruits national staff. But then these national staff, if the operation stops or reduces, gradually the number of staff reduces as well. So it is true that in any operation in the field, national staff come and go, much more than international staff, who then can be deployed elsewhere. That's what happened. So my emergency is finished in Congo, but there is another emergency or another operation required in Myanmar or in Aceh, like I've been there or elsewhere. So I go to Aceh, in Indonesia. So that's what happens. International staff, they go from one operation to the next, but up to a point when you have recruited too many international staff, it becomes difficult to keep them on the job. So you need to gradually cut international staff. That's where that's a problem. But the issue indeed is the ratio of international staff to national staff is like maybe it should be 1 to 10, not more. 1 international, maybe for 10 national, or less, depending on the operation. But I'm French, indeed. There is no operation in France, but I was recruited many, many years ago in the 80s to go to the Sudan because there was an emergency in Sudan. There were also new positions. So I was recruited to go there at a junior level of international staff, and I grew up there. Not because I'm French, but because maybe when I was recruited, people thought I had the right profile because I'd already worked elsewhere in other countries and so on. But now it would be much more difficult for me because of this, we try to have this geographical balance and gender balance. Being French, and France does not contribute much money to the UN, nor is very interested in the UN, by the way. I'm a male, so I have a lot of bad things going against me. So it would be maybe difficult now for me maybe to get recruited if I were to start. Whereas if I were maybe, because of the need to balance, to strike a balance, if I were a woman from a so-called underrepresented country, Burkina Faso, for example, or Laos, maybe I stand a better chance. So merit and geographical balance, indeed, and gender are these sort of, but merit is very, is a very, how would I say, can be subjective at times.
I don't think by law in the UN system, because you contribute a lot of money, you have to be selected. Such thing in the bylaw?
No, there's no such thing in the bylaw, but it's just about horse trading again, because somebody from the US government could go to the Secretary General, say, if you don't do that, I'm going to reduce my contribution or I'll be upset. So they say that in much more diplomatic language, but they have much more power, if you want, the power of holding, for example, in the permanent member of the Security Council, among which France is, the 5 permanent members. They have a lot of extra powers relative to others because they have a direct link to the Secretary General, and they have more power than those who may not be necessarily, in the Security Council. So it's a lot of horse trading, I agree, which should not take place. I agree with you entirely. But that's the reality of international relations. International relations, as I say,
really?
is basic. It's a war with silk gloves. Okay, so even the UN sometimes does things in certain countries that it should not do. It puts undue pressure on weak government, and where there are strong government, it sort of folds. And I've seen that. I lived many years in Haiti, and the UN has done a lot of bad things in Haiti, including anyway, I'm writing about it in another thing, but it has done a number of bad things in Haiti, like also intervening directly to change the results of elections. So that is totally scandalous. It should never happen. This is an extreme case, by the way. Thanks God, it's not happening, but it has happened. So that is the reality of international relations, which is not good. I'm not saying we should accept it. I say we should know it and fight it.
I see. So you said clearly there is no bylaw. The country which contribute a lot of money should be requisite the most. There is no bylaw. But like Permanent Security Council, they say something, UN have very little chance to avoid or something like that. So it's almost realistic, realist view is they have to accept it, something like that. And so
no, you don't have to accept it. You can choose to ignore it, and sometimes the UN does ignore even pressure. Sometimes, but not often enough. But take other example. If you take, it's not a UN agency, the International Monetary Fund, which is not a UN agency strictly, but is associated with it, a very powerful entity, financial entity, of course, but it only recruits from maybe a dozen universities, not more, the so-called best financial universities. Is that fair? I don't think so. But that's what happened, and people know about it, but they don't, Now maybe IMF will say, no, that's not true anymore. It used to be true, maybe I think still true for decades. They just recruit from not even a dozen universities, people, So, and so what about, you can be excellent even if you are educated in a university in Bangladesh or in Colombia or wherever. Why is only those from US and UK basically, and France to a lesser extent? Why? It's not good.
Right. Example, overseas development system ODA should be contributed by country 0.7. Every country should contribute that 0.7, right? Many countries did not fulfill.
No, but 0.7, as you said, is, I think, almost for practical purpose is dead. Even countries like Norway, Denmark and Sweden and Finland, even when they reach some of them and beyond that, you have to look at the granularity, how they count. Because sometimes they would even count the refugees who are in Norway as part of their contribution, of part of the 0.7, when refugees in country are much, much more expensive than if you deal with refugees on the ground. So on the ground, like, in developing, in poor countries. So even the good actors, those who did well, when you analyze a bit the data, it's not sometimes always as good as what it looks. But all that we said, it was still better than those who not only didn't reach 0.7, but have been now going down, which is not only the United States of America, by the way, but even Europe has decreased. European Union has decreased its contribution to humanitarian action. European countries are decreasing. UK has radically decreased its contribution to the UN or to humanitarian action, radically. So all these countries, are at fault because there are crises, whereas the world has never been as rich as now, by the way, in financial terms, but they continue decreasing because the pressure is less, and also, as you implied, these were international agreements, or we should aim at 0.7. But if you don't do it, there is nothing the UN or anybody can do about it except name and shame. Oh, you're a bad boy because you have not reached 0.7. But nobody cares, and that's the problem. We sometimes want some of these painfully agreed upon goals, like the famous Millennium Development Goals. It has become like a mantra that everybody repeats ad nauseam, but with no impact on the ground whatsoever. So, and that's what we have to have our eyes wide open. We should not, believe our own lies that people are living by these development goals, because the governments mention them, but they don't pay, they pay lip service to it, nothing else, nothing else. They don't really mind, they don't really care. They have other priorities. They're really less and less, which is very short-sighted, by the way, less and less pay attention to, which is short-sighted, as I said, because the world is a small planet, it's a small world, and whatever happens, be it on the environment side, on the human rights side, has an effect on all of us. And the fact that we don't.
It is a sign of collapsing UN or international system. Because if you don't respect or you don't follow the international norm and standard, what will be the future? It will be ultimately collapse, or it will be any reform, or those, it's a kind of selfish, you can say. Those who have capacity, they don't want to do that.
No, but you're right. I think the international system, and the UN is part of it. It's not the only one, but it's a big part of that. The UN, the international relations system, is in crisis. Now it's only and openly led by people who are exerting or abusing their power over the others. That's it. So is it really what we used to call the law of the jungle is now really back in force, and all the nice manners have been thrown out. So indeed, now we're really now in a system where it's just the law of the jungle, to put it that way. So the system is in crisis, as you said. Has it collapsed? Not yet. Is it collapsing? Perhaps. But that's why we need to first resist. It should not collapse, because if it collapses, as you say, the strongest will survive, but at the end of the day, you will die too. Because if your children and women die, everybody dies down the road. So everybody suffers. In one generation or whatever, everybody will die. So that's a short-sightedness that you mentioned that is true. So that's why we need to resist. But to resist, we need to be smart. So we should not say, everything is fine, keep it as it is. No, we cannot keep it as it is no longer. The UN needs to evolve radically, not only small reforms on the margin, but it needs really to radically change. Fewer agencies, maybe bigger agencies, fewer agencies, fewer people, much more focus on crucial issues. You mentioned human rights, I mentioned governance in the field, and I would mention coordination of actors on the ground when there is a need for that in support of the local structures. And I would say also the norms. We need international norms. If we did not have international norms, no plane would be flying in the skies. They would either hit each other or whatever. You need norms.
Right.
You need humanitarian norms, you need technical norms, and that's what the UN is good at too. So that's what you need.
Right. Other things, there are many things, but humanitarian and those refugees are very basic, fundamental, urgent things, in terms of human rights, and life saving, in terms of life saving, and those maybe UN can focus mostly those affected area, human rights violated area, humanitarian crisis area.
I think I would even say, as I hinted at, that there is almost an overcapacity, because even in the humanitarian and human rights field, the UN does things that it does not need to do, that it should leave to NGOs, for example, or local NGOs, or local or international, regardless. So still, even in the humanitarian field, development field, the UN does things that it should not do, or that other people could do more cheaper, and sometimes even better. So the UN is expensive. We're expensive. So there is a capacity. I think there is an overcapacity in certain aspects, and there is an undercapacity, like in human rights. There is an undercapacity in supporting in governance, governing, whereas that should be one of our key areas of intervention, because that's where you leave a lasting impact. So in areas where it would be in most demand, sometimes the UN is undercapacitated. Human rights, governance. But in other areas, like intervening directly, doing projects like NGOs do, we have too many staff doing that. So that's my point. So overall, there is more than enough in terms of staff to take care of the many crises in many countries, not only Myanmar or wherever, Ukraine, but in Africa, in Latin America, Asia, and so on. But I think we need to refocus, shift, go away from day-to-day projects that NGOs can do. Get out of that, but focus more indeed on human rights, focus more on supporting local structures in regions, even at capital, central ministries or local ministries or local authorities. Support them so that they do their job better. That's where we should be, much more.
So is there any practical, exactly UN have developed the framework?
Oh, yes, there are cooperation agreements everywhere we go. My point is that there is no clear division of labor, or not sufficiently. So, of course, the UN does collaborate and does coordinate in the humanitarian sphere NGOs. Very often the UN has a lead role in a humanitarian crisis, a role that is given to it because it gets a lot of funding from the member states and funding that it gives to NGOs. So there are standard agreements either at central level or at the country level. But the point is that the UN still behaves too much like a glorified NGO. And that's my point. So we should get away from that, move out of that, and let NGOs do, and give much more space to local NGOs, because local NGOs very often are the very poor cousin. International NGOs get a lot of money, local NGOs, very little.
Right. Sometimes collaboration also a lot of restriction and very difficulty collaboration, it can be imposed. So it should be more flexible and more easy to collaboration that NGO and organization, local organization can easily work together.
You're totally right. I mean, it happens, but far too little. And there are always, yes, we should empower the local NGOs. We always say that. In practice, we don't. Or sometimes we sort even entrust international NGOs to coach local NGOs, but then there is no exit strategy. And I tried to impose that those international NGOs that were coaching national NGOs should get out within 1 or 2 years and let local NGOs take over. They agreed in principle. In practice, it doesn't happen all the time. And again, these are far too few examples, but it should happen. The second problem is also that what do we coach local NGOs for? We coach local NGOs through the same silly or crazy bureaucratic requirements that member states or donors impose on us. So basically, we teach local NGOs to parrot, to mimic what the UN does, know how to submit the right format of the report, the right project submission. So it's all about parroting or mimicking what we do, which is not good because it imposes a lot of constraint on local NGOs. It imposes a lot of reporting requirements. Most of them are crazy and not necessary. But that's what also the bureaucracy of the UN has become. So it's a bit of everybody does more and more and more reporting that nobody reads, by the way, not even the donors who ask for it. But nobody said, hey, stop it, it's getting crazy. So we're imposing a system, a bureaucratic system on local NGOs that these local NGOs very often cannot sustain. But this system itself should change.
Right, definitely. And whenever we talk about UN reform systems, some always people are saying about UN Security Council, many talking about those permanent security councils should be extended or like that it should be more than five. How do you think it will be work, or French and UK may not agree, or because African people are asking?
I'm not even sure there should still be a Security Council, by the way, considering that it is fairly useless. It is because, again, it's just a mirror image of the bad side of international dynamics. So, do we need a Security Council where you have invariably the US against China and against USSR and Europe, with the US? What purpose does it serve? But what it is a no-brainer that the Security Council should be enlarged to 20 members, say. But it's still useful. Why don't we give? Well, maybe it is, but now obviously you need to have 3-4 African countries, 3-4 Asian countries, and so on. If only based on population projected or present, So obviously it should be not only on let's take whatever one country because it is powerful in military terms, by the way, or sometimes economic terms. So these are for me obsolete criteria. So is a Security Council useful? Necessary? I'm not sure. Useful? No, it is not useful for the moment. Necessary? Perhaps, but not at its present shape. But put 20 members, all same level, same no blocking. No blocking votes like the 5 permanent members. If you don't have consensus, nothing happens. That's why nothing happens.
So it's still there is no solution, right? Cannot able to find a good solution yet. There is
solution. There are solutions, but the solutions, even if UK and France and the US were to say, oh yeah, we agree, we should enlarge. They say yes, but they act no. So, and even if they say, okay, fine, you can come in, we can enlarge, like they've done, they've enlarged a bit the Security Council by taking rotating members, but the 5 permanent ones are 5 permanent, and they have a blocking vote. This should stop.
I mean, theoretically they agree, but practically they don't want to do anything yet.
Of course not.
So that is the problem. Do you see any way to the UN can have independent funding without any pressure for contributed country?
Well, you will always have pressure from those who contribute, but that's why the UN, again, needs to do a better job at fewer things, I think, and it would cost less money. What I would do, on the contrary, is that I would do like they already happens, but at a minimal level, is I would make compulsory contribution. Each country should mandatory contribute to the UN, like they do for the Secretariat of the UN and for the peacekeeping operations, where the countries are obliged to contribute. What I would do is I would put all UN operations. It is very radical what I'm talking about. I would put all the activities on a mandatory basis, so that you're not anymore dependent on a voluntary contribution from a member state, because all the UN in the field, whether it's UNICEF, World Food Programme, UNHCR, or whatever, are dependent at 95% on voluntary contributions. So even if it is the United States of America who contributes heavily to those operations, they are voluntary, they are not mandatory. So they can stop anytime. Whereas if you put a system whereby first the UN costs less money, because it does fewer things, but better, but everything is mandatory, then you are less dependent. Then you are more independent and more able to do your job impartially. Why certain operations are better financed than others. Ukraine is very well financed. in a way, because it serves the purpose of Europe. And they don't want to see it, so it's close to their near abroad. Many operations are very well financed when it serves the political purpose of the country is concerned. So, and that's why it is unfair. That's why it is unfair, because a refugee, when I was in Uganda, my operation was financed by one major member state, heavily, over 60%. But it didn't put pressure on me. It was okay. But there is pressure elsewhere sometimes. It could happen that this operation was not very political for them.